There are things a man carries for so long that they start to feel like part of him, like a second skeleton underneath the one everyone else can see. My name is Arthur. I'm 79 years old, and last spring I sat my 3 grown children down at my kitchen table and told them something I had kept hidden from them for 40 years. The look on their faces is not something I will ever forget. I want to tell you about that day, but to do that, I have to take you back much further, back to a man I used to be before I became the father they knew. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everybody's business was everybody else's business, except when it wasn't. My father was a steel worker, quiet man. Not cold exactly, but not warm either. He showed love through showing up, through working, through fixing things around the house without being asked. I think I understood him better as I got older than I ever did as a boy. He wasn't a man who talked about what was happening inside him, and neither was I, for most of my life. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth about where I came from. I married my wife Eleanor in 1971. She was 24. I was 26. We were young in a way that only makes sense looking backward. Young in the way where you think you understand the world because you've managed to survive a few hard things. We had our first child, our son David, the following year. Then came Margaret in 1975, and our youngest, Carol, in 1979. The same year I turned 35 and started to feel, for the first time, the weight of being a grown man with a life that was fully underway, no longer just beginning. Eleanor and I had a good marriage. I want to say that clearly, because what I'm about to tell you is not a story about a bad marriage. It's not a story about betrayal in the way people usually mean that word. We had arguments, stretches of distance, years that were harder than others, but we loved each other in the way that grows roots over decades. The kind that doesn't announce itself every day, but is simply there, underneath everything. What I kept from her, and from our children, had nothing to do with another woman or money or anything like that. It had to do with who I was before Eleanor, and with something that happened to me in the years just before we met. Something I buried so deep that for a long time I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened at all. In 1968, I was 23 years old and I had just dropped out of my second year of college. My father was furious. My mother was quiet about it in that way she had, which was somehow worse. I told them I needed to work, that the money wasn't there, which was partly true, but the fuller truth was that I was falling apart in ways I didn't have words for. I was depressed, though we didn't use that word then. Not in families like mine. You were either fine or you needed to pull yourself together, and there wasn't much room in between. I moved to Pittsburgh, got a room in a boarding house on the north side, and took a job in a print shop. And it was there, in that city, during those 2 years between dropping out of school and meeting Eleanor, that I lived a version of my life that I never showed anyone. There was a group of people I fell in with, not dangerous people, not criminals, artists, mostly, painters, a few writers, musicians who played in bars on weekends. People who talked about things I had never heard talked about at my parents' kitchen table. I was 23 and lonely and hungry for something I couldn't name, and these people seemed to have found something, a way of being alive that didn't require you to keep everything tamped down. I started painting. That's the part my children didn't know. For 2 years, I painted almost every evening in a small room I rented above the print shop. I wasn't talented in any extraordinary way, but I was serious about it. I read about art. I went to galleries on my lunch breaks. I had a friend named Raymond who painted large canvases full of color and texture, and he used to say that making something with your hands was the only honest thing a person could do. I believed him. For 2 years, I believed him completely. And then I met Eleanor at a church social of all places. I wasn't even supposed to be there. A coworker had dragged me along because he was trying to impress a girl and didn't want to walk in alone. Eleanor was standing near the window talking to someone, and she laughed at something the other person said. And I remember thinking that the laugh sounded like it cost her nothing, like she had more where that came from. I introduced myself that evening. We were married 2 years later. When Eleanor and I got serious, I started to feel the distance between that version of myself and the life we were building. She came from a practical family. Her father ran a hardware store. Her mother was a school teacher. They were good, grounded people who valued stability and hard work, and those things were real values, not small ones. I wanted to be the kind of man who could provide a stable life. I wanted it genuinely, not just because I thought I was supposed to want it. So I packed up the paintings. I stopped seeing Raymond and the others. I told myself I was simply growing up, making choices the way adults do, trading one set of possibilities for another. And I did believe that, at least in the beginning. But over the years, something about keeping that chapter hidden began to change its meaning. What had started as a private decision to move forward became, without my ever intending it, a kind of secret. And secrets have a way of growing heavier with time, not lighter. I think about why I never told Eleanor. Honestly, in the early years, it just never came up in a way that felt natural. And then enough time had passed that bringing it up started to feel strange. What would I have said? That before I was the man she married, I was a different kind of man, and I put that man away on a shelf? It sounds like nothing when you say it plainly, but it didn't feel like nothing. It felt, for reasons I still find hard to fully explain, like something I owed an explanation I wasn't sure I could give. Eleanor died in 2019, 58 years after I first saw her laughing by that window. She had a stroke in February and was gone within the week. There is nothing I can tell you about losing a person like that, not in any way that would actually reach you, unless you've been through it yourself. I'll just say that the house changed. The quality of the air in every room changed. I changed, in ways I'm still discovering. After she was gone, I found myself thinking about those 2 years in Pittsburgh more than I had in decades. I don't know entirely why. Maybe because Eleanor's death made me feel, for the first time, that my own was no longer abstract. Maybe because I had spent so long being the person other people knew that I found myself wondering, in the quiet of a house with no one else in it, whether I had ever fully known myself. I started looking for the paintings. I had stored several of them in my brother's basement years ago and forgotten about them. My brother had passed in 2009, and his wife, God bless her, had kept everything. She let me come and go through his things, and one afternoon I found them there, wrapped in old cloth, a dozen canvases that I had made in my early 20s in a small room above a print shop in Pittsburgh. I sat on the floor of my brother's basement for a long time looking at them. They weren't great paintings. I can see that now with the eyes of an older man, but they were real. They were made by a young man who was trying, in his clumsy, earnest way, to understand something about being alive. I recognized him, and for the first time in 40 years, I felt something like tenderness toward him. I brought the paintings home. I hung a few of them in the back room, and after a while I knew that I wanted to tell my children. Not because I had done anything wrong, not because I had kept a terrible secret, but because those paintings were part of who I was, and I had been their father for 50 years. And there was a piece of me they had never seen. I asked David and Margaret and Carol to come for Sunday dinner last April. We ate first. I didn't want to open with it cold. After the dishes were cleared and we were sitting there with our coffee, I told them I had something I wanted to show them. I brought them to the back room. I watched their faces as they looked at the paintings. Margaret said, very quietly, "Dad, did you make these?" And I said yes. And then I told them the whole story. The print shop, Raymond, the years of painting, why I'd stopped, why I had never said anything. There was a silence when I finished that I couldn't read at first. And then David, who has always been the most like me in his quietness, said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" And I had to think about the honest answer, because I think for a long time I believed that the man who made those paintings was a version of me that hadn't worked out. And I didn't want my children to see their father as someone who had abandoned something. I wanted them to see a man who had chosen, fully and without regret. But sitting in that back room with the three of them, looking at those canvases, I realized that keeping that part of myself hidden hadn't protected them from anything. It had just kept them from knowing me completely. Carol cried. She said she wished she had known sooner. Margaret asked if she could have one of the smaller paintings, and I told her she could have whichever one she wanted. David was quiet for a long time, and then he said something I have thought about nearly every day since. He said, "I always wondered where I got it from. He paints too, has for years, watercolors mostly, landscapes and still lifes. I knew this. He had shown me his work over the years, and I had always admired it without ever making the connection to those 2 years in Pittsburgh. Or maybe I had made the connection and hadn't let myself look at it too long. I don't know. Some things you keep yourself from seeing until you're ready to see them. If I could speak directly to whoever is listening to this, I would say something simple. There are parts of you that you have put away because you decided at some point that they didn't fit the life you were building. Maybe you were right. Maybe the choice you made was the right one. But those parts of you are still real. They are still yours. And the people who love you might want to know about them, not because they need a confession or an explanation, but because knowing the full shape of someone is one of the deepest forms of closeness there is. I'm 79 years old. I have lived long enough to know that there is almost no cost to telling the truth about who you were, who you tried to be, what you loved, and then set aside. The cost, I have come to believe, is in the carrying, in the weight of keeping a whole version of yourself from the people who have spent their lives sitting across the table from you. The paintings are in the back room. Margaret took the small blue one with the river in it. It's hanging in her kitchen now, which is more than I ever expected when I wrapped those canvases up in cloth and set them in my brother's basement half a lifetime ago. I like knowing it's there. I like knowing she looks at it while she has her morning coffee and knows, now, a little more about who her father is. That's enough for me. At 79, that is more than enough.